The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise.
The language you use around these choke points is that of economic warfare. Are we seeing a war play out between the US and its enemies like Russia, Iran, and China?
Yes, to be clear.
It makes a world go round. Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML compliance and financial crime to the real world. Turn on the TV, scroll your phone, or if you're feeling retro, pick up a newspaper. The headlines are full of war and global conflict. But according to the author of a new book, modern warfare isn't being fought on the battlefields anymore. It's the economy, stupid. War is now waged through payment systems, supply chains, strategic waterways, insurance markets, and more. And perhaps unsurprisingly, no one does this better than the United States of America. I'm your host, Robin Lycka, resident sanctions man at Strise, and in this episode we're asking, how did sanctions become a political weapon? We will cover how successive US governments shaped the sanctions landscape, the ripple effects of compliance professionals, and what the future holds as the global sanctions space fractures and potentially breaks. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Edward Fishman, author of Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, and Tyler Nielsen, CEO of Sanctions Advisory. Welcome to The Laundry, both of you. Edward, can you tell our listeners about you, your background, and your new book?
Well, Robin, thank you so much for having me on today. And it's particularly a pleasure to be on with Tyler, who I've known for quite some time. So I've been working on sanctions economic statecraft for my entire career. I actually joined the Treasury Department in the front office of the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence within a week of graduating from university. So this has been a story that has cut across my entire professional life. The motivation for writing my book, Chokepoints, for those of you who haven't read it, it's an accessible narrative history of how we moved from the win-win era of globalization in the 1990s to what I call the age of economic warfare. My motivation really came from my time in government, working on the response to Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine, when I honestly was concerned in that period that we didn't have the intellectual capital in the US government to actually put together sound, coherent, forward-looking strategies for economic warfare. And so my biggest goal for my book, as well as my teaching at Columbia University, is really to train the next generation of sanctions practitioners and really elevate our dialogue, both in the United States and around the world, about how economic warfare works.
Great. And Tyler, what should our listeners know about you, your background, and Sanctions Advisory?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Robin, for having me. And of course, yes, it's great to be on with Eddie. Just like Eddie, I've spent my whole career doing sanctions, first for the U.S. government at Treasury State and at the embassy in Helsinki. I actually started on Syria sanctions, then morphed into Iran, and then that became focusing on Russia. But then by the time I left 7 years ago, I was covering a bit of everything around the world when it came to U.S. sanctions programs. I always like to say that I covered, I think it was over 27 programs at one point. 7 years ago, I moved to Copenhagen to head up Nordea's sanctions compliance team. And then now I'm the CEO and principal advisor for Sanctions Advisory, where what we do is we take everything that I've learned in my time and career in government and in the banking sector and provide that advice and insight to clients so that they can tap into the knowledge that we have to manage, as Eddie so eloquently puts, the age of economic warfare. It's a challenging time. So, I saw the need for some help to be provided, and we do that locally from our headquarters in Copenhagen, and we have an office in Oslo as well.
Perfect. Thank you both for joining us. Funny story about how Tyler joined the episode as well. We have our little sanctions network. I refer to it as the Good Sanctions Club. And we had a little after sanctions debate over a nice beverage. And I was just randomly explaining how the next episode would be about sanctions as a weapon. And I said, well, the guest is Edward Fishman. And Tyler goes, I know Eddie. He's my friend. And we decided there and then, I texted our producer, Matthew, we decided there and then that it would be great to have both of you on. So thank you both. Glad we got this set up. Let's dive into the discussion. Eddie, your book is called Chokepoints. So how would you define economic choke points?
Sure. So throughout history, choke points, when you've thought of that concept, have really referred to geographic features, right? You think of the Bosphorus, which connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and onto the Mediterranean, or the Strait of Hormuz, where a fifth of global oil flows go through every single day. And throughout history, these control over these choke points has conferred great leverage over the powers who control them. What my book talks about is how in the wake of hyperglobalization in the 1990s, when you have China, Russia, other former communist states joining the global financial system, international supply chains, and you actually for the first time get a truly integrated global economy, we have these invisible economic choke points that get created. Principally the dollar-based financial system, but also things like semiconductor supply chains, energy supply chains. And the way I would define it simply is it's an area of the global economy in which one country has a dominant position and there are very few, if any, substitutes. And so what that means is if you control one of these choke points, so for instance, the US government has the ability to regulate correspondent banking accounts where dollar clearance happens, you can just literally pass a regulation and cut off any foreign actor from that choke point. And so what that has done in the last 25 years is it's given the American president and the Treasury Department and State Department by proxy incredible power over the global economy. The ability literally to sign documents from offices in Washington and impose devastating economic harm on foreign countries. And if you just think about that, I mean, it is a revolution in the use of economic warfare that is akin to the dawn of air power for military warfare, where all of a sudden you don't have to commit to naval blockades or really risky maneuvers to impose devastating economic harm on adversaries.
And where do you think sanctions fit into this hierarchy?
Yeah. So, I mean, sanctions are probably the most powerful way that the US has to weaponize these choke points. Because if you think about what a sanction is, I mean, and to be clear, the way I define economic warfare is it's really any tool that you're using to restrict economic flows to impose pain on an adversary. So sanctions, tariffs, export controls, and investment restrictions, they're all various weapons in the arsenal of economic warfare. Sanctions are the most powerful because if you think about it, what a sanction is it fully cuts off a target from the US financial system. So an example I like to give, because this is in the news, I've got a young daughter who I make pancakes for every Saturday morning. And we use maple syrup that oftentimes is imported from Canada. The US has been talking about imposing a 25% tariff on Canada. If we were to do that, and by the way, Trump's backed off from it numerous times, but let's say we actually did, I could still buy my daughter's maple syrup from Canada. I would just have to pay 25% more than I was paying before. It's basically just a tax on top of the price. On the flip side, if we were to go ahead and sanction that Canadian maple syrup company, it would be illegal for me as an American to buy the maple syrup from that company. And probably more importantly, the Canadian maple syrup company would be totally cut off from the US financial system. They couldn't transact in dollars, and if they had any dollar-based bank accounts, they'd be frozen. So chances are they would probably go bankrupt within the next day or two. So sanctions are a much more powerful tool than tariffs and are the most powerful tool that the US possesses for economic warfare.
That's a great analogy, an analogy I can get behind. Tyler, you're someone who understands the Washington system and sanctions. How have you seen these choke points evolve in your time in office?
So certainly, first I do have to put a plug in, though, that Eddie should be buying Massachusetts or at least Vermont maple syrup and not Canadian maple syrup. I got a good guy in Western Mass for you that I can put you in touch with. So right from the very much agree with Eddie in his articulation of, from the government point of view. From the we need to comply with this professional point of view, the choke points are the necessary avenues to make your business flow. So for every company doing business anywhere, getting paid for that business that you do is a choke point, right? So the banks are the choke point, and that's where you definitely have that, direct problem of US sanctions permeating every aspect of your life because the banks themselves want to maintain access to the US. And so even if you're not doing any business with the US, right, as a small private company here in Denmark or Norway, you still are impacted by the reality that the banks for someone else will want to make sure that they can access the US. And that's where those rules come into play. I think the biggest growth that we've seen over time, particularly, in the last decade of sanctions, has been going from those, simple sanctions, this person's now designated, they are cut off from the US, to a much more complex effort to try and still, utilize those choke points, but to achieve, much more narrowly tailored aims, which for us on the compliance side means a lot more questions we have to ask to know, is this subject to sanctions or not? Take the sectoral sanctions, right? Is this new debt over such and such maturity? Is this new equity, right? It's a lot simpler if it's just, nope, that's spare bank. We're not going to do anything with them. That's where we are now as a result of the growth of sanctions. But, a few years ago, it was certainly not the same when it came to all the Russian banks.
So the language you use around these choke points is that of economic warfare. Are we seeing a war play out between the US and its enemies like Russia, Iran, and China?
Yes, to be clear. I mean, I think that I made an explicit decision in creating a title for my book, Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. It's not American Power in the Age of Sanctions or in the Age of Export Controls. I actually think we get ourselves in trouble, not only in the US, but also in the European Union. When we talk about things like sanctions or tariffs, like it becomes almost so wonky that it's like anodyne and it like makes people's eyes glaze over. And I also think it in some ways undervalues the significance of what's happening, right? I mean, when you're thinking about what the US and Europe are trying to do with respect to sanctions on Russia, we are literally trying to use sanctions to push Russia out of Ukraine, to stop Russia from conquering its neighboring country. If you're going, with some technical, wonky tool, it's not going to work, right? You have to be willing to really throw your weight around if you're going to be using economic weapons for really high-end objectives. I also think that if we are honest with ourselves, we stop using euphemistic language, we talk about economic warfare for what it is, hopefully our governments will start taking it more seriously and start investing in in the government apparatus we need to actually fight and win economic wars. The same way, by the way, in the US, we have an incredibly effective apparatus for recruiting and training professional troops, planning for warfare, exactly what the Pentagon does. We have nothing like that for economic warfare, and it puts us at a big disadvantage.
And what is the fallout for the US allies and other nations from this strategy?
Look, I mean, I think that during for much of the last 4 years, for the Biden administration had made Europe a real partner in these various economic wars, right? When you look at the Russia sanctions that were imposed in the wake of the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, really the ideas for the sanctions were coordinated jointly between the US, Brussels, individual European capitals, the UK, Japan. It was really a joint G7 project. The same, by the way, goes to a certain extent for the export controls on China and high-end technologies, right? I mean, the Dutch had an intimate role in designing those, as did the Japanese. I think the challenge, what we're seeing now, to be honest, Robin, is that Trump has been using economic warfare not just against American adversaries like China and Russia, but also against our allies, wielding tariffs against Canada and Mexico, against Europe, against even Japan and Korea. And I think that's a dangerous scenario that we get in because for two reasons. One is I think it will incentivize our American allies to hedge against us and to start questioning whether they really want to put all their eggs in America's basket. And two, something that I think does not get enough attention is we have literally helped Europe and the UK and these other countries build up their own economic arsenals. And so if they really need to, they could retaliate pretty aggressively against the United States. And I think a great example in Europe is, the Europeans have developed this anti-coercion instrument that was explicitly developed in the EU with respect to China. The idea that if China was going to be bullying an individual EU member state, that the EU could respond collectively with economic retaliation. Now the EU is talking about wielding that against Washington. Right. So I do worry that, we've sort of trained up our allies to be very effective at fighting economic wars. And now we are risking fighting them. And I just don't think that's a wise decision for the current U.S. administration to be going toward.
Yeah, super interesting developments. And also the aspect of centralized digital banking currencies in this as well. Tyler, what's your take on it?
So I very much agree. I mean, I loved it when Eddie and I were working together at the State Department and Dan Fried was leading regular trips to Europe to make sure that everyone on both sides of the Atlantic was closely aligned, was closely participating in the sanctions discussion to craft the broadest and most impactful set of measures possible when it came to Russia's first takeover of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine, right? And we had very much a similar pattern play out, similar approach these last few years when it's come to Russia. But now everyone is potentially an enemy. And, let's take an example very close to where I currently am, Copenhagen. There has been a lot of direct talk by this administration about Greenland and how Greenland should not be part of Denmark anymore, right? It should be part of the US. Because the tools of economic warfare are now being wielded in all kinds of directions for very much wildly disparate aims, right? It's not just we're designating that person to make sure that they change their behavior. Are we really confident that the tools that have been built up won't attempt to be used against Danish companies? How confident should we be that there won't be attempts to enforce against U.S. sanctions to try and gain leverage against some of the largest Danish companies? Several months ago, when folks would ask me about U.S. enforcement, I had a wildly different answer about how to approach that for Danish companies than I do right now, which is very unnerving for a lot of folks because the rules have just changed so quickly and very well may change again, quickly. We are definitely in a wholly different world than we were in just a few months ago. And I think it's going to constantly change and that churn is going to keep happening for a while now. And it's mostly about how can we try and steel ourselves to that reality and kind of accept where we are to deal with it, because it is definitely the new age that we are in.
Can you just clarify for our listeners who Dan Fried was?
So Dan Fried, yes. Well, I mean, everyone should know who Dan Fried is. But he was the first, the sanctions coordinator at the State Department. He is a longtime career diplomat. He served in the former Soviet Union way back in the day, 2-time ambassador to Poland, had a glorious and illustrious career right throughout the U.S. government. And then his last posting was as the first State Department sanctions coordinator.
And he is a central character in Chokepoints. So if anyone wants to learn about him, you can read about him on the page.
You can read Chokepoints, as I have.
Okay, we'll be right back to talk about the future of weaponized sanctions. Don't go anywhere.
I want to introduce you to a game changer in the compliance and portfolio risk management, the Strise Portfolio Health Dashboard. This new feature gives you a comprehensive overview of your portfolio risk right from your Strise homepage. What we've built is tackling 3 of the most critical challenges we all face when it comes to portfolio health. 1, the lack of visibility into portfolio level risk. 2, relying on time-consuming and fragmented data sources. 3, missed compliance obligations due to unclear and inaccessible data. From feedback with compliance officers using our product, we know that having access to a central view is vital in being able to quickly identify PEPs, sanctions, and risk levels across all entities, so you can quickly identify high-risk accounts that need immediate attention. And for those of you working as risk analysts, it's likely that you'll want to be alerted about any up-and-coming reviews for high-risk accounts to ensure a timely and effective risk management. That's exactly why we've created the Portfolio Health Dashboard. Stay tuned for what's next.
And welcome back. Okay, having looked at how we get to the present day strategy, let's move the chat on to how this evolves going forward. Eddie, do you believe the current sanctions landscape, the tariff wars, and other economic choke points point to the end of globalization?
Yes. I think globalization is effectively dead as a concept. And what we're seeing right now is kind of the fitful dissolution of it, which is going to take many, many years, right? So I think if you just generally look at how we have major shifts in our concept of international order and global economic management, the first step is often an intellectual shift. It's when people lose faith in the current system. And then it oftentimes takes years, if not a decade or more, for the actual reality of the international system to then conform to a new idea, right? I think the way I look at it is we do clearly have quite a bit of economic interdependence that's persisting, right? The US still has massive trade relationships, even with China. But you can't find anyone in the US who considers the US China economic relationship win win, right? You can't find anyone in the US, maybe with the exception of Steve Witkoff, who thinks that the US Russia relationship is win win. So I think that it's quite clear that the faith in the underlying principles of globalization have died. What has not happened yet is we don't have a concept of what comes next. And I think that one of the broad narratives that I seek to tell in my book, Chokepoints, is really how we moved from, the period of my childhood, the 1990s, when we really viewed every country around the world as sort of our potential friend, to one now where, we have a period of this intensifying geopolitical competition. And if you're trying to understand, I think, why US presidents as diverse as Barack Obama and Donald Trump have both used sanctions and export controls and tariffs so much. We've actually seen a secular exponential increase in the use of sanctions in the US from George W. Bush to the most recent Trump administration. So it's cut across every single president. It's because the global economy is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s, but we're living in a period of intensifying geopolitical competition. And there's that mismatch. And one way to view kind of the sanctions, tariffs, export controls is that they are sort of this haphazard retreat from that deep and comprehensive globalization that we lived with for a few decades.
And we're sort of approaching a fork in the road between EU and US sanctions policies. Does this show that sanctions are becoming more politically aligned?
I mean, I think they were. Again, just to loop back to what Tyler and I were talking about before the break, I think during the Biden administration, there were massive strides for the US and Europe to actually be more politically aligned. And I think maybe to zoom out for a second, Robin, the question I think that is on a lot of people's minds is, well, if we are going to be unraveling economic interdependence, what's the new global economic order going to look like? I think where we were headed during the Biden administration is a concept called friendshoring, where we would have two big economic blocks, one that was the US and other democracies, so the US, Europe, North America, Japan, Korea, Australia, et cetera. Another one that was led by China with Russia, Iran, and some others, and then maybe a messy middle in between with countries like Brazil and Turkey. And that was sort of where we were headed, right? A global economy that actually looked somewhat similar to the one we lived with during the Cold War, where you had big economic blocks. The thing I worry about is, given what we were talking about just a few moments ago, with Trump using American economic warfare, not just against the adversaries, but also the allies, I think in some ways we risk backsliding, at least in the US, into something that looks more like autarky, in which, as a US company, the only place you can really feel confident locating your supply chain is within the United States. And the reason I worry about that is, of course, as an American, it would slow economic growth, lead to higher inflation, I think scarcity, given just how much we depend on imports, from all other countries. But the thing I actually worry about even more is what history shows is that when states can't feel confident in their ability to acquire markets and resources through open trade, they're tempted into things like imperialism and conquest. And so I think when you hear about Donald Trump talking about the need to seize Greenland for its mineral resources, I don't know whether or not he's serious about that. But that mentality is something that I think we risk if we do have an autarkic world economy. Because then, the only way we can feel confident in having these mineral resources is to literally plant the American flag on the icebergs of Greenland.
And Tyler, are businesses increasingly going to have to choose between Team US and Team EU? We've seen how the UK has looked to OFAC to learn how they set up the initial sanctions screening, the lists, everything, how they've handled it. How do you think this will impact the work of compliance teams going forward?
So it's only going to make it much more complicated. I mean, the real direction of travel will be in the even more senior management deciding, where do we want to do business? Because where do we want to do business then is going to dictate what are the rules we need to follow. Because I very much agree with Eddie's articulation of where we were headed and even messier version now. But it's not as though only the US is imposing, using the tools of economic warfare to its advantage. China is imposing export controls on rare earth minerals. China is imposing its own tariffs, its own approach, right? Russia doing very similar things, making it very difficult even if you wanted to operate in Russia. So the real challenge for compliance professionals is going to be navigating the environment of we have cross-cutting rules, right? We have different rules, and we're trying to do business everywhere at the same time. A lot of companies still have a policy of we will follow the law wherever we operate. That is their sanctions export control compliance policy. That is a nightmare of a policy to adhere to, even right now. But now fast forward where we have even more countries asserting their right to use these tools themselves. Now we have to juggle Brazil, Canada, US, EU. I think a real key for companies is going to be, having a real clear direction of travel of where do we want to go. That's very difficult in the current time of so much uncertainty. But having that North Star of this is where we want to do business and this is where we're going to focus on doing business will make it as easy as possible. But we're headed for a lot more work for compliance professionals, which if you're in the business, then I guess it's okay.
Yeah, I was thinking we have the central AML authority in the EU, AMLA. Do we need an independent body to rule on sanctions? Could we ever see something like that?
I mean, I don't. Right, we already have the UN Security Council as the kind of most central policymaking body for imposing sanctions, but there's plenty that's been written about the shortcomings of that approach. I think certainly in Europe, we are making great strides in terms of aligning as one European bloc. The fact that we now have common rules on what violations of sanctions need to be, is a great step as we go down the path of having more common enforcement. I wouldn't put any stock or effort in having a independent body, that controls things transnationally. But I do think there's a lot of effort and a lot of good work that's happening to make the rules of enforcement and the rules of sanctions compliance a bit easier in Europe with a single authority and less dependent on national authorities. But we still have, it's a marathon. We're only a couple of kilometers into the whole distance we need to travel to get to a OFAC-like or an OFSI-like situation here in Europe.
Where does this story end? America's current economic weapons are durable, not indestructible. If used recklessly, they could be broken forever.
Yeah, you're quoting from my book, which I appreciate. Is there a risk that if the United States uses sanctions too much, that it's going to lead to a global referendum on American economic power? And these choke points we talked about at the beginning of our discussion could erode, right? My own view is a little bit different from that. And I think that asking the US government or the EU or any government, frankly, to use sanctions less is a bit of a fool's errand because, as I discussed, there's a structural underpinning here that we have deep and comprehensive economic interdependence in an age of increasing geopolitical competition. So I think sanctions are going to be used. The question is, how are they used? And I think the real risk we have in the US is what I would call misuse of sanctions. Just to give you two important dates, and just because I think the juxtaposition will help listeners understand what I'm saying. In April of 2018, this was sort of the month that Donald Trump fell in love with economic warfare. It's when he unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. It's when the U.S. first imposed export controls on ZTE that almost shut down the second biggest telecommunications equipment maker in China. And most importantly, from the purposes of this story, it was when Trump, under pressure from Congress, imposed sanctions on Rusal, the Russian aluminum company, which is the second largest aluminum company in the world. And some listeners may remember the chaos that ensued, right? A spike in aluminum prices, almost the biggest smelter in Europe almost shutting down, Ford almost having to stop production of the F-150 pickup truck. And really quickly, within a day or two, Trump effectively backs down and backtracks because he realizes it was a mistake. And yet, if you look at what happened in the wake of that move, the Central Bank of Russia dumped all of its dollar holdings. They reallocated their reserves from dollars primarily to euros and secondarily to gold and the RMB. And Russia also started settling its cross-border trade largely in euros. And so post the Rusal sanctions in 2018, Russia became the first big economy in the world to effectively Euroize their economy, which is remarkable because it shows that when the US does use sanctions unilaterally like that, you can actually risk the dollar's use. But then you fast forward to 2022 in February, 24 hours after the Russian big invasion of Ukraine. There's a debate that occurs within Washington as well as Brussels and other European capitals about whether or not to sanction the central bank of Russia. And one of the stories I tell in my book, Chokepoints, is how Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary in the US, was opposed to sanctioning the central bank of Russia because she worried that it would lead to an even bigger referendum against the dollar. She ultimately lost that debate, and the US and the G7 did impose sanctions on the central bank of Russia 48 hours after the invasion started. And then fast forward 3 more years from then, at the dawn of the new Trump administration, what has happened? The dollar actually has gone up as in its use of global payments since 2022, which is remarkable, by 50%. It took share away from the euro, from the pound, and the yen. And I think the reason is that the US worked alongside allies on the sanctions of the central bank of Russia. Because I think it's remarkable, right? In 2018, there were sanctions against one aluminum company in Russia that led to significant de-dollarization. In 2022, there are sanctions against the biggest target in Russia, and the dollar actually increases in global use afterwards. And I think what that shows is really how important multilateralism is, how important it is for the US to work alongside our allies, primarily in Europe, but also in Asia and around the world. Because I do think if the US uses sanctions unilaterally, arbitrarily, capriciously, we will see a global referendum against the dollar. We will see other currencies like the euro chip away at the dollar's global role. And maybe that'll be good for Europe, but I know for a fact it'll be bad for the United States.
Okay, before we end this episode, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. Eddie, you go first. Tyler, you go second. And remember, briefly, are sanctions a force for good?
They can be, but when they're misused, they're usually a force of bad.
Yes, but any tool can be misused.
What would you change in sanctions policy tomorrow if you could?
I would have the US government build a much more coherent policy apparatus for imposing sanctions. Instead of distributing sanctions across all these different agencies, I'd have a centralized agency responsible for economic statecraft so that we could actually use the same kind of strategic planning for economic warfare that we use for military warfare.
I would have a commitment that sanctions are broad and simple, and that we start at a maximalist sanctions position instead of trying to escalate higher and higher as more and more bad items happen. So keep it broad, keep it simple.
Okay, switching order, Tyler first, Eddie second. What should compliance professional keep an eye out in the next 4 years under Trump?
Everything. It is now an integral component of every compliance professional's job to be a geopolitical analyst. It's only a surprise if we're not looking for it. And following what is happening in real time is the surest way to actually be able to predict and adapt and align to where the world is heading, because we're not going to get any more notice for those changes going forward.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe my advice would be hire Tyler, because I think that it's only going to get more complicated. And I think if all you're doing is responding to the regulations that are in place right now, you're going to be well behind events, and you have to be thinking ahead.
Are sanctions a political weapon?
Yes, Eddie said that. But even more so for the compliance professional, it's important to appreciate that sanctions are politics. They are war by other means. It is a political tool first and foremost. And understanding the politics will help you understand the regulation and understand the rules a lot better.
Agreed with Tyler. They're a political weapon.
That brings this spin of The Laundry to an end. Eddie and Tyler, thank you so much for joining me. Eddie, where can people find and connect with you?
You can follow me on the app formerly known as Twitter at Edward Fishman. You can also, friend me on LinkedIn. But most importantly, read my book, Chokepoints, and then send me an email or a message and let me know what you think. Because the most gratifying thing as an author, having spent years writing this book, was to hear from people what they think of it.
Tyler, how about you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, very active, sharing insights there regularly. You can also find us at sanctionsadvisory.dk and in lots of local Nordic hangouts as well. Always talking about sanctions with the good sanctions groups.
Money makes a world go around.
Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, check out the back catalog of 7 seasons and more than 100 episodes, and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell a colleague about it, give us a 5-star rating. It really helps people to find us. What subjects do we need to cover? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Robin. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. And our engineer was Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. Visit strise.ai for more information, and see you next time.
It makes the world go round.
One last question for you. What did the oligarch say when he was sanctioned? Oh, fuck.
That's a good one.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise.